The cold came first. Not wind. Wind, she knew. This was something older. A slow breath rising out of the rock, brushing her face like the mountain itself had just woken and noticed the girl standing there. Her hands were bleeding. 3 days of clawing at vines thick as her wrist, and now they shook around the handle of a rusted blade. She was 16. No family. No money. Nothing in all the world but a folded scrap of paper that called this place worthless. A hole in a hillside. An overgrown cave no one had touched in longer than she had been alive. They had told her she'd inherited nothing. Less than nothing. A ruin not even worth the climb up the hollow. So why had someone sealed it shut? Why did the vines grow thickest right here, over a doorway in the stone, as if they had been planted to hide it? She pulled back the last curtain of green, and the dark behind it was not empty. It was breathing. Something was alive in there. Something a grandmother she had never met, a woman who had somehow known the girl would come, had spent a whole quiet life protecting in the dark. She lifted the lantern. She stepped inside. And afterward, nothing was the same. The morning she turned 16, the world decided it was finished with her. There was no cake, no candle, no song hummed soft over a kitchen table. There was only a knock on a door, and a voice on the other side telling her to come downstairs. She knew the voice. She had spent 6 years learning the weather of it. When it meant scrubbing, when it meant silence, when it meant a girl was about to lose something she hadn't known she still had to lose. This morning, it meant the last thing of all. The woman who ran the home sat behind a wide desk in a room that smelled of cold tea and old paper. She did not look up when the girl came in. She let her stand there a moment, the way you let a kettle settle before deciding it isn't worth the trouble of pouring. Then she slid a folded sheet of paper across the wood. "You're not our concern after today," the woman said. That was all. Not cruel, exactly. Worse than cruel. Tired. The flat, smoothed-down voice of someone who had said these same words to a long line of girls, and would say them to a long line more, and had stopped hearing them somewhere back along the way. The girl reached out and took the paper. Her fingers were steady. She had learned, somewhere in those 6 years, how to keep her hands from shaking when it counted. It was a small skill, but it had been hers, and no one had been able to take it. Beside the paper sat a cloth bag, drawn shut with a bit of string. Inside it, the girl already knew, was everything the world had decided she was worth carrying away. 2 dresses, worn thin at the elbows, a comb missing half its teeth, a pair of shoes that had once belonged to feet smaller than her own. That was the sum of 16 years. A bag a child could lift with one hand. She lifted it. She had not always been quiet. There were stories, the kind that get whispered between the older girls and the younger ones, that long ago, before the home, before any of this, she had been a child who asked questions until the grown-ups grew weary. Why did the rain fall sideways some days and straight down on others? Why did the green things lean toward the window? Whether you could fool a growing plant by holding a mirror where the sun should be. The home had no patience for questions like that. The home wanted hands that scrubbed and folded and stayed busy. It wanted girls who would grow into wives for men who needed an extra pair of hands more than they needed a voice across the supper table. So the girl had folded the questions away, the way she folded the worn dresses. But she had kept one habit they could not break her of. She read. Whatever drifted into the donation bin, torn pages, broken-backed books no one wanted, she took. She read by what light she could find. She read under blankets when the lamps were out. She read about far places and old wars and the slow secret work of roots in the ground. Once she had spent a whole hour watching a vine climb the side of a wall, watching the small blind tip of it feel its way upward, and she had earned a hard hand across her face for the watching. She had not stopped watching. She had only learned to do it where no one looked. The paper said she had been left something. A grandmother. A name the girl had heard exactly once in her life, spoken quickly and put away, like a thing some families don't want a child to ask about. This grandmother, a stranger, a woman the girl could not have picked out of a crowd of one, had died. And in dying, she had left the girl an inheritance. The word on the page was a grand one. Estate. But the lines beneath it took the word apart, piece by piece, the way a hard frost takes apart a garden overnight. A stretch of steep, wooded hillside. A small dwelling, the paper warned, in poor repair. And a cave. An overgrown cave, the paper said. Sealed off. Unsafe to enter. Of no value. Worthless. The woman who ran the home had let the girl read every word for herself, and when the girl reached the end, the woman folded her own hands on the desk and offered, in the same tired voice, a final piece of wisdom. Some people, she said, leave you exactly what they had, and sometimes that's a hole in a hill. There had been a small sum of money mentioned in the letter. The woman kept it. For expenses, she said. For the trouble of all these years. The girl did not argue. Arguing was a kind of hope, and hope, she had learned, was an expensive thing to carry. It weighed more than the bag. So she took the paper for the hole in the hill, and she set the strap of the bag across her shoulder, and she walked out the front gate. No one walked her to it. No one stood in the window to watch her go. The gate swung shut behind her with a small iron sound, and that sound was the whole of her farewell. The town she came to had the look of a place the railway had stopped loving. Gray buildings, leaning, a main street where every storefront seemed to be giving up at the same slow, patient pace, as if they'd all agreed on it. Low smoke that hung over the rooftops and showed no hurry to leave. People watched her from their doorways as she passed. A girl with a cloth bag and a folded paper. New faces were rare in a place like this, and rarely the kind that meant good news. A man with a wagon agreed to carry her up the hollow. He smelled of damp wool and old tobacco. And he drove like some men do when they're hoping the passenger won't make them talk. For a long while, the girl let him have his silence. Then she asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the morning. Did anyone know her? My grandmother. The man worked his jaw a moment before he answered, as though the words had to be loosened first. Knew of her? He said. She kept to that hollow most of her years. Came down twice a season, maybe. Bought salt, bought nails, said little, went on back up. The wagon creaked over a root. Folks let her be, he said. She seemed to want it that way. Some people do. And the cave? His eyes stayed on the rutted track ahead of the mule. Nobody's set foot in that cave longer than you've been alive, he said. It grew over, years back, and she let it grow. Never gave a reason anybody heard. After that, she stopped letting a living soul near the place at all. He glanced at her then, just once. A thin girl in a thin dress, riding up into the green nowhere with everything she owned in one small bag. "You got somewhere else to be," he said. "If this turns out to be what they say it is." "Nothing?" The girl looked straight ahead, up the narrowing track. "No," she said. "I don't." He did not ask again. Some answers close a subject like a door closes a room. The track ended where the green began. The man drew the wagon up at a place where two muddy ruts vanished into a tunnel of leaves, and he pointed up the slope with his chin. "Cabin's a ways on. You'll find it. Just keep climbing." He handed her a key on a loop of dirty string, and then, after a pause, he reached into his own coat and pressed a folded bill into her palm. Quickly, the way a man does a thing he doesn't want thanked for. It was an apology, that bill. An apology he didn't have the words for. The girl closed her fingers around it. Then the wagon turned in the narrow track, and the mule's hooves found the way back down, and the creak and the rattle of it grew smaller and smaller until the green swallowed the last of the sound. And she was alone. Not the alone of a crowded room where no one speaks your name. She had years of that kind. She could have worn it like a coat. This was a wider alone. A green, breathing, watching alone. The hollow rose up steep on either side of her. The trees leaned together overhead until the daylight came down soft and broken and the color of weak honey. Somewhere below, water moved over stones, talking to itself. A bird called once, and then thought better of it. The girl tightened her grip on the bag, and she walked up into the green. The cabin was smaller than she had let herself hope, and stronger than she had let herself fear. One room, a plank floor worn smooth in a single path between the door and the hearth, as though one pair of feet had walked that line 10,000 times. A stone fireplace blackened by old fires, a roof that sagged in one corner, but had not yet given in. She stood in the doorway a long moment before she crossed it. The smell reached her first, dried herbs, dust, and underneath both, something green and earthy and alive, something that had soaked so far into the wood that no closed door could keep it out. Then she stepped inside, and she saw that the room was full, not full of comforts. There were almost none of those. A narrow bed, neatly made, a table, a small black stove, a single chair drawn up to it. The room was full of work. Jars stood in rows along every windowsill, catching the broken light. Each one held something: leaves, seeds, dark powders, pale roots curled like sleeping things. And each was labeled in a careful, slanting hand that the girl found strangely she wanted to keep looking at. And the walls. The walls were papered over with drawings, pinned in neat rows, edge to edge. Cross-sections of roots reaching down through marked layers of soil. Fine webs of threading lines spreading through wood and stone like frost, spreading across a winter window. Maps of the hillside, drawn over and corrected and drawn again, marked with arrows and numbers and small notes about water and light and how deep a thing could go before it stopped. And books, stacked on the floor, lined along a single shelf, piled by the leg of the bed. Not the books the girl had grown up around. No sermons here, no worn black covers. These books were about growing things, about soil and seed and the hidden lives of plants in the ground, about a word she had read once, long ago, and not seen since. A word that meant the study of the pale things that grow in the dark. The girl who had stolen books from a donation bin and read them by stub-end candles under a blanket. The girl who had been struck once for watching a vine climb a wall stood very, very still in the middle of that room. Because it did not feel like the room of a stranger, it felt like the room of someone she might, in another life, have been able to understand. And that frightened her more than an empty ruin ever could have. On the table, an open book was waiting, not a printed one. A journal, bound in cracked dark leather, its pages soft and worn at the corners from the touch of a hand that had turned them a great many times. It lay open to the last page. The girl set down her bag. She bent over the table, and she read. The handwriting on that final page was not steady like the labels on the jars. It wandered. The letters leaned and dragged and trailed off, as letters do when the hand that shapes them is tired, or sick, or running out of the thing there is never enough of. But it could be read. The woman had made sure of that. She had pressed hard enough. The cave holds everything. If she comes, if the girl comes, she must clear the way herself. No one can do it for her. The vines are the door. What is behind them is the answer. The girl straightened slowly. The cabin was very quiet around her. Outside, the creek went on talking to its stones, and the broken daylight moved a slow inch across the plank floor. If the girl comes, a woman she had never met, a woman whose face she could not call up, whose voice she had never heard, whose name she had been given exactly once and told to leave alone. That woman had spent the last of her strength leaning over this table, shaping these crooked, careful letters. For her. For a girl she would never live to see. The girl pressed both palms flat against the wood of the table. She felt the grain of it under her hands, the cool weight, the plain, undeniable realness of it. For 6 years, no one had waited for her. No one had kept a chair. No one had left a lamp burning by a window. No one had written down a single word with her in mind, or held a place in the world open against the day she might walk into it. And now, a woman in the ground had reached up with a pencil and left her a door, and trusted her, a stranger, to be the one who would open it. The girl did not weep. She had given up that particular coin a long while back, in a place where tears bought nothing at all. But she lowered herself into the single chair, slowly, and she let out a breath she felt she had been holding for years, and for the first time she could remember, the breath went all the way down. She sat with the dead woman's words a while longer. Then she rose, and she went out to find the cave. Finding it was not the work of an afternoon. The hillside behind the cabin climbed up steep and close, a high green wall that drank the daylight before it could reach the ground beneath. The vines had taken the whole of it. Thick ropes spilled down from the heights, layer over layer, woven through one another until the slope seemed bound in a net that no one had ever sat down and meant to weave. Grapevine as thick as her own wrist, creeper threading up the rock beneath it, and over everything a flowering tangle so dense that she could push her arm into the shoulder and not touch stone. It was beautiful in its way, a green fortress, patient, silent, alive. It had closed over whatever lay behind it, like a hand closes over something it has decided to protect. She did not know where to begin, so she began where she stood. In the cabin, she had found a short, curved blade for cutting brush, its iron gone red with rust, its wooden handle worn down to the shape of a hand that was no longer in the world. She fit her own hand into that hollow. It almost fit, and she began to cut. The first day taught her how little she knew. The vines did not fall as she had imagined they would. They bent under the blade and sprang back. They tangled around the iron and around her wrists and around each other. When she pulled, they pulled back, anchored somewhere deep and unseen, as if the hill itself were holding on. By midday, her palms had blistered. By evening, the blisters had broken open. She had cleared a patch of bare rock no wider than a window, and the green wall seemed not to have noticed her at all. That night she lay on the narrow bed in the cabin of a woman she had never met, and she listened. To the creek, to the wind moving high in the trees, to the small settling sounds of an old house breathing around her in the dark. She did not feel safe exactly, but she felt something she had no good name for. She felt expected, as though the cabin had been holding its breath for a long, long time, keeping the silence ready for someone, and that someone had finally come in out of the dark. She slept, and she did not dream of the home, or the gate, or the iron sound it made closing. She dreamed of green. The second day, she changed her way of working. She had watched a vine climb a wall once. She had paid for that hour with the flat of someone's hand. But she had learned a thing in that hour that no blow could ever quite knock loose. Vines did not shove. They did not force. They reached. They found the smallest crack, the weakest seam, the one place that would give, and they followed it. So the girl stopped fighting the whole green wall at once. She started hunting its seams instead, the places where one vine crossed over another, the knots, the joints, the strained spots where the weight pulled hardest. She cut there, and the great ropes loosened all at once, and whole curtains of leaf came tumbling down into her arms. It was slow work still, filthy work. Her hands bled freely now, and the blood and the green sap mixed across her wrists and dried there into a second skin. But the rock began to show, inch by inch, foot by foot, bare gray stone, cool and damp, surfacing from under all those silent seasons of growth, like something rising up from the bottom of deep, still water. And as the rock came clear, the girl began to feel a thing she could not yet put a word to, a pull, a nearness, as though the hill, having waited so long, had begun, very slightly, to lean toward her in return. It was on the third day that the mountain breathed on her. She had worked from first light without stopping until her arms shook and the rusted blade weighed twice what it should. She had stopped thinking by then. There was only the rhythm of it, the reach, the cut, the pull, the reach again, and her own breath, and the green coming down. And then her face went cold, not from the wind. The wind had died hours before, gone still in the trapped green hush of the hollow. There was no wind to do this. This was something else. It rose up from below, from within, a slow, steady breath of cold against her sweating skin, air that did not belong to the warm afternoon, air that had the deep, clean chill of a place the sun has never once reached. She went absolutely still. She lifted the back of one bleeding hand before her face, and she felt it pass across her knuckles, cool, damp, even, constant as a sleeping thing's breath. It was coming through the vines. It was coming from behind them. The girl forgot her hands then. She forgot the deep ache buried in her shoulders, the fire across her palms, the hunger that had been her companion for 3 days. She cut faster. She tore at the green with both arms, flinging it down the slope behind her in great wet armfuls, working with a sudden hunger that surprised even her. And the cold breath grew stronger as she worked, the way a voice grows clearer as you cross a room toward it. Then the light shifted. The sun dropped low enough to slide in beneath the canopy at a long gold slant, and it reached the rock she had laid bare, and it showed her, at last, the thing the vines had been keeping, a darkness, a gap in the living stone, taller than she stood, wider than her 2 arms could span, framed all around by smooth gray rock and curtained still by the last few hanging ropes of growth that swayed faintly in the cold breath rising from inside. An opening, a door into the hill. The girl stood in the lowering gold light with her chest heaving and her ruined hands hanging open at her sides, and she looked at the dark place that had been breathing on her for 3 days. The cave, not gone, not fallen in, not worthless, whatever a tired woman behind a wide desk had let her read, waiting. Just as the woman who wrote the journal had waited. Just as the cabin had waited, with its lamp unlit and its chair drawn up. Just as everything in this strange green hollow seemed to have been waiting, holding still, keeping faith, for a girl who had not yet been born when the waiting first began. Something in her wanted to step through right then. The pull of that cold, dark mouth was almost a sound, almost a voice calling up a long hallway. But the light was failing fast, and she had no lamp at hand, and some old, careful part of her, the part that had kept her quietly alive through 6 years of being no one's concern, laid a hand on her arm and told her to wait for the morning. So she did not go in. Not yet. Instead, she stepped close to the cleared rock, close enough to set her open palm flat against it, and she felt the cold of the deep earth rise up through the stone and into the heart of her hand. And that was the moment she saw the marks. They were faint, worn soft by long weather, half hidden still beneath the growth she hadn't reached. But the low gold light caught the small shadows lying in the grooves of them, and she leaned in close. Letters, cut into the stone above the opening, carved by a careful, certain hand, a very long time ago. She reached up and pulled away the last thin screen of leaf, and she traced the grooves with one bleeding finger, slowly, and one by one the worn marks gave up their meaning to her. A name, Cora, and beneath the name, a number nearly rubbed away by the years. A date so far back that when the girl worked the arithmetic of it in her tired head, something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the breath of the cave. This woman, her grandmother, had once stood on this same slope, had cut these letters into this stone with her own 2 hands, had claimed this hidden place for her own. In a year before the girl's own mother had drawn a single breath. And then, at the long quiet end of a long quiet life, she had done the strangest thing of all. She had let it close. She had stood by. For years, the man with the wagon had said. Years. And watched the vines climb slowly back across the doorway she had marked with her own name. She had let the green seal it shut, a little at a time, until not one living soul knew what lay behind it. The girl understood now why. You do not carve your name above a thing you mean to forget. The grandmother had not let the cave close over to bury it. She had let it close to keep it, to hold it safe in the dark behind a living door that only the right person would ever have reason to open. A door that would turn away the curious and the careless, and the men with wagons, and the women who called things worthless without ever once looking past the leaves. A door that would yield to one thing and one thing only, to someone who needed it badly enough to bleed 3 days clearing the way to it, to someone with nowhere else in the whole wide world to go. The girl drew her hand back from the stone. Below her, the hollow had gone soft and blue with dusk. The creek went on murmuring to its stones. The first cool stars were pricking out above the dark line of the ridge, and behind her, the cabin held its small, patient, expectant silence, holding it the way it must have for so many empty seasons. She looked at the dark mouth in the hillside. She did not know what was inside it. She could not have guessed, not the half, not the tenth of it. She knew only that the air came cold and clean and steady from somewhere deep within, and that a woman she had never met had spent the last of her strength begging her to walk through. The vines are the door, the journal had said. What is behind them is the answer. The answer to what, the girl could not yet say. But she knew one thing. Knew it the way a person knows a thing low in the chest, before the mind has caught up to put words around it. She had been handed something the whole tired world had called nothing. A hole in a hill. A ruin not worth the climb. And the whole tired world had been wrong. She would go in at first light. She would find the lamp she'd seen on the shelf, and she would fill it, and she would light it, and she would walk into the dark that had breathed on her for 3 days, and she would see for herself what a stranger had loved enough to seal away from every living eye. The girl turned back toward the cabin, her bleeding hands held loose at her sides, her thin shoes slipping on the dew-wet grass. But at the doorway, she stopped, and she looked back once at the carved name catching the very last of the light. Cora. A woman who, it seemed, had waited her whole life, and then somehow longer than her life, for a girl she would never lay eyes on. All right, the girl said softly. To the dark, to the stone, to the name, to no one at all. Her voice came out steady. Her hands did not. All right, I'm here now. And the cold breath of the mountain rose up out of the hill and moved across her face like an answer that had been a long, long time in coming. Morning came thin and gray into the hollow. The girl woke before the light was good, and she lay a moment on the narrow bed, listening, as she had learned to listen in a house full of sleeping strangers, for whatever the day meant to ask of her. But this house held no strangers, only the creek, only the small ticking of a stove gone cold, only the cabin breathing its old patient breath around her, and out there, up the slope, the dark mouth in the hill, waiting. She rose. She found the lamp on the shelf where she'd seen it, a battered thing of glass and tin, and she filled it from a can of oil that smelled of long storage. Her hands, scabbed and stiff from 3 days of cutting, fumbled the wick. She steadied them. She had learned that too. How to make her hands obey when it counted. The flame caught. It steadied. And she carried it out into the gray morning, up the wet slope, to the place where the green had finally given way to stone. The opening was darker by daylight than it had seemed at dusk. By dusk, it had only been one shadow among many. Now, with the pale morning behind her, the dark inside the hill looked deeper than dark had any right to look. It drank the lamplight at the threshold and asked for more. The cold breath rose to meet her, steady and even. The girl stood there a moment, lamp lifted, and she let herself feel the whole weight of it, that she was 16 and alone, and about to walk into a hole in a mountain that a tired woman had told her was worth nothing at all. Then she thought of the crooked letters on the table. If the girl comes, she must clear the way herself. She had cleared it. She stepped inside. The first part was only a passage, a natural hall in the limestone, just wide enough for her shoulders, just tall enough that she did not have to stoop. The walls were damp under her fingertips. The floor was smooth, worn smooth, she understood slowly, not by feet, but by water, by a patience older than any feet at all. Her steps came back to her off the stone, small echoes, walking just behind her. Water dripped somewhere ahead in the dark, counting out a slow rhythm, and the air did not change as the air in a closed room changes. It stayed cool. It stayed clean. It moved faintly against her face, as if the hill were drawing breath somewhere far inside and letting it out again. She walked perhaps 30 steps into the hill, the lamp throwing her shadow long and trembling on the wall. And then the passage opened, and the girl stopped where she stood. The chamber was enormous. The lamplight could not find the far end of it. It could not find the ceiling. The little flame threw its glow out as far as it could reach, and then simply gave up, swallowed by a darkness that arched away above and beyond her into a vast unseen. But it was not the size that stopped her breath in her throat. It was what was growing there. Mushrooms. Not a handful. Not a patch. Thousands. They covered the chamber in the soft, reaching dark. They grew from logs laid out in careful rows along the floor, pale and clustered and overlapping. They grew from shelves cut straight into the living stone of the walls, shelf above shelf above shelf, filled with some dark, rich, crumbling stuff that smelled of the forest floor after rain. They spilled from bags that hung on wooden frames overhead, tumbling downward in pale cascades that caught the lamplight and seemed— the girl pressed her free hand to her mouth— seemed almost to glow. She turned slowly in place, the lamp turning with her, and everywhere the light reached, there was more. Gray fans of them, ruffled at the edges, fanning out from the open ends of cut logs. Brown caps pushing up through bark in tidy, crowded rows. White, shaggy waterfalls of them, tumbling from the high shelves like something frozen in the act of falling. And deeper in, where the light barely carried, where the cold lay heavier and the air felt wetter against her skin, pale golden things, ruffled and strange, growing from a dark bed someone had built and tended and fed. The girl walked deeper into the chamber. Her lamp shook in her hand. Her shadow lurched along the rows. This was no accident of nature. The logs had been cut to a length, stacked to a pattern. The shelves had been carved with a chisel and a steady arm. The frames overhead had been fitted and bolted into stone with a care that spoke of 1,000 hours, 10,000, a lifetime of them. Someone had built this. Someone had stood here in the cold and the dark, season after season after season, and shaped a place where things could grow that had no business growing underground at all. A woman nobody visited. A woman who came down from the hollow twice a season and bought salt and nails and went back up. A woman the world had decided was strange and let alone, and finally called worthless. She had been building this. The girl sank down onto the cold stone floor, there among the rows, and the lamp settled beside her and threw its small, steady light up over the pale growing things. And something broke loose in her chest. It was not weeping, not at first. It came out as a sound she did not plan. A single, startled laugh, loud in all that stillness, bouncing back at her off the unseen walls. Then another. And then, somewhere in the middle of the laughing, the other thing came too. The thing she had locked away years ago in a place where it bought nothing. And the two ran together until she could not have told you which was which. She laughed until she wept. She wept until she laughed, alone on the floor of a mountain, surrounded by a cathedral of pale glowing things that a stranger had spent her whole life building in the dark. The girl let it all the way out, because she understood now the shape of what had happened to her. A woman she had never met had built something extraordinary inside a hill, and when she knew her time was running short, she had not torn it down. She had not sold it off. She had not even told anyone it was there. She had let the green grow up and locked the door, and she had left a message on a table, and she had trusted against every reasonable thing that the right person would come. A girl with nowhere else to go. A girl who watched vines climb walls. The woman had been right. Not because the girl was special. The girl did not think she was special, but because she had been desperate enough to try, and patient enough to keep on after the trying turned to bleeding, and the cave had opened to her. The first weeks were hard in a way the girl had not been ready for. She had the cave. She had the cabin and its walls of paper and its shelf of strange books. But she had almost no food, and no money to speak of past the folded bill in her pocket, and only the dimmest idea of what the pale things in the dark actually were. So she did what she had always done. She read. The journals told her the rest of it. There were several of them, she discovered, packed in a trunk beneath the bed, filled cover to cover in that same careful slanting hand, the hand that had only gone crooked at the very end. She read them by lamplight, late into the cold nights, as she had once read stolen books by candle stubs, and slowly the shape of the dead woman came clear. Cora had come to the hollow as a young widow, long ago, carrying a knowledge of growing things she had learned at her own mother's side. She had found the cave by chance and known it at once for what it could be: the steady cool, the unchanging damp, the clean stone, the soft moving air. And she had begun, season by patient season, to grow things in the dark that the daylight world said could not be grown. The girl read it slowly, one finger under each line, and somewhere in the reading, the dead woman stopped being a stranger. She had been a girl once too, alone too, with a head full of questions nobody wanted, and a pair of hands that could not stop reaching for the things that grow. By the time her hand was steady and sure in those early journals, Cora was raising a harvest underground that astonished even her. The cave does not change, she had written. In one entry, the girl read 3 times over. The heat of summer does not reach it. The frost of winter does not reach it. It holds one long, cool breath all the year round. and in that breath, the pale things flourish. The world above forgets them. Down here, they are remembered. The girl read that, and she set the journal down on her knees, and she sat a while in the lamplight, thinking about being remembered. She learned from those pages which of the pale things were safe. She was careful. She checked one journal against another, and then against a third, before she let a single thing near her mouth. The gray fanning ones she trusted first. The journals were certain of them. The books agreed. And she carried an armful up to the cabin and cooked them on the stove in a little fat with a handful of wild green things she'd found along the creek. She ate, and then she ate more. And then she sat back from the table with both hands pressed flat against her aching middle, and she felt a thing she could not at first place, because it had been so long since she'd felt it that the body had nearly forgotten the name. Full, not the gray, endless, almost enough of the home, where a girl rose from the table still thinking of the table. Full. The kind of full that lets a body sleep without dreaming of food. The girl laughed, alone in the cabin, a soft, surprised sound. And then she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, embarrassed by it, though there was no one in the world to hear. The cave had fed her. A stranger, 3 seasons in the ground, had reached out and fed her. And for the first time since the iron gate had swung shut behind her, the girl began, very carefully, cupping a hand around a small new flame, to hope. She was not alone in the hollow, as long as she had believed. One gray morning, well into those early weeks, the girl came around the side of the cabin with an armful of cut wood and stopped short. There was a woman at the door, an old woman, small and square and weathered, with hands like roots and eyes that did not miss much, standing on the worn stone step as though she had stood there 1,000 times before, which, the girl would learn, she nearly had. The woman looked the girl up and down, slow and frank, the way you look over a calf at market. You'd be the one she waited on, the old woman said. It was not quite a question. The girl set down her wood. Her heart was going hard, but her voice came level. You knew her, Cora? Knew her near 40 years. The old woman's mouth moved in something that was not a smile and not its opposite. She told me a long while back that there'd be a girl. Said it had come from far off, from a place that didn't want it. Said one day it would turn up at this door with no notion what it had walked into. The old woman's eyes moved past the girl, up the slope, to the dark, cleared mouth in the hill. And here you are, she said, skinnier than she let on. The old woman's name was Bertie. She lived, she said, a good way down the creek, in a cabin of her own, alone these many years. She had known Cora as well as anyone living had been let to know her, which was to say, a little, and more than most. She brought me baskets, Bertie said, settling herself onto the step as if she meant to stay a while. Years of baskets, the pale things from down in that hill. Best eating in the hollow, and don't let any fool in that gray little town tell you different. She snorted. Most of them never tasted it, scared of what they hadn't seen. People are. Did you ever go in? The girl asked. The cave? Never asked to. She never offered. Bertie looked at her sidelong. She kept her own counsel, that woman. tighter than bark on a tree. When her hands started to go and she couldn't tend it proper, she let the green close it up. Told me it'd keep till the right one came. I figured she'd lost the thread of things. End of it. The old woman shook her head slowly. Seems she hadn't lost a thing. The girl looked at the small, fierce old woman on the step, and the old woman looked back at her, and something in the weathered face shifted, gentled, just at the edges, just for a breath. "What do they call you, child?" Bertie asked. It landed strangely. It had been a long while, longer than the girl wanted to count, since anyone had asked her name and waited for the answer as though it mattered which one it was. At the home, she had mostly been you, or girl, or the back of a name flung across a laundry room. She told the old woman her name. She said it quietly, almost shy of it. "Della," Bertie repeated, trying the weight of it, and then she nodded once as if she decided to keep it. "Well, Della, you're going to need help, whether you've the pride to admit it or not. And I've got nothing else pressing." She got to her feet with a grunt and a creak. "I'll be back in a few days. Don't drink from the lower creek. It'll turn your stomach. Use the spring up behind the cabin. And patch that roof corner before the weather sets in, or you'll wake up swimming." She was halfway down the slope before the girl found her voice. "Why?" the girl called after her. "Why would you help me?" Bertie stopped. She didn't turn all the way around. "Because she asked me to," the old woman said. "A long time back. And because somebody ought to have helped you a good while before now." Then she went on down the slope, and the green took her, and the girl stood at the door with her name still warm in the air where the old woman had said it. Bertie came back as she'd promised. She came every few days through those first hard weeks, and she always brought something. A sack of meal, a clutch of eggs wrapped in a rag, a wool blanket she swore up and down she had no use for. She was gruff, and she was plain-spoken, and not once did she offer so much as a pat on the shoulder. But she came, and in the coming, she gave the girl the thing the journals could not, the rough, living, hands-on knowing of how to last in a place like this, how to split a shingle and set it true so the rain ran off and not in, how to read the look of the sky and know whether tomorrow would bring soft weather or hard, how to lay food by so it would carry a body through the cold months when the green died back and the ground locked up. In return, the girl fed her. She carried baskets of the pale things down the creek to Bertie's door, the gray fanning ones and others she had learned to trust, and Bertie ate them and grumbled that they were near as good as Cora's and would be better when the girl quit overcooking them. It was, the girl thought, the closest thing to family she had been handed in a very long while. Not soft, not sweet, but steady. And steady, she was learning, was worth a good deal more than sweet. It was Bertie, in a roundabout way, who set her toward the second thing. She kept more than mushrooms down there, the old woman said one evening, watching the girl turn the pale things in the pan. Cora, she used to say she was keeping something safe. I always took it she meant the cave, the pale things. Bertie frowned at the fire. But she'd get a look, saying it, like there was more to it than she'd let on. There near always was, with her. The girl turned that over for 2 days, keeping something safe. Then she went back into the hill with her lamp and one of the journals, and she read by its light in the great cold chamber, among the rows of glowing things, until she found the passage she half remembered. "The back room holds the rest of it," Cora had written. "I sealed the way when my hands began to fail, so the damp of the main chamber would not reach it. It must stay dry. It must stay dark. It must stay cold. What is in there is worth more than all the harvest of this cave together, though no one in that gray town would give a copper for it." The girl lowered the journal. She lifted the lamp, and she went looking for a door within the door. She found the tunnel at the far end of the great chamber, past the last rows, in a corner where the light had never quite reached. It was low, narrow, and it was blocked, not by any accident of the hill, but by a careful wall of stacked stone, fitted by hand, deliberate as a closed fist. Someone had sealed this on purpose. The girl set down her lamp, and she began to move the stones. It took the better part of 2 days. The stones were heavy, and her hands were still tender, and more than once she sat back on her heels in the dark and wondered whether the dead woman had simply walled off an empty hole to keep a girl busy. But she remembered the crooked letters. She remembered the vines are the door. So she kept on. And on the second day, she lifted away a stone and felt the air change beyond it, drier than the main chamber, stiller, holding a different kind of cold. She cleared a gap wide enough for her shoulders. She took up the lamp, and she squeezed through into the dark beyond. The room on the other side was smaller, drier, just as the journal had promised. The damp that beaded the walls of the great chamber did not reach in here. The air was close and cool and old, and it smelled of paper and dust and dry wood and something faintly green underneath, the ghost of green, the memory of growing things long since gone to seed. The girl lifted the lamp, and the light found the shelves. They ran along every wall, carved into the stone, just as the shelves in the great chamber had been carved, by the same patient chisel and the same patient arm. But these shelves did not hold the pale glowing things. They held jars, hundreds of them, glass jars of every size and shape, old canning jars with rusted rings, squat little bottles, tall thin ones, anything, the girl understood slowly, that could be sealed tight and would hold out the damp. Row on row on row of them, climbing the walls of the little room from the floor to past the reach of her lamp, and inside each jar. She stepped close. She held the light to the glass. Inside each jar were seeds. Seeds. Not a handful in a packet. Not a gardener's leftover odds and ends. A whole room of them. A whole hidden room, carved out of a mountain and sealed shut by hand, holding more seed than the girl had ever seen gathered in one place, more than she had known there were kinds of. And each jar was labeled, in that same careful, slanting hand. The hand from the journals, the hand from the windowsill jars, the hand that had only failed at the very end. The girl moved along the shelves with her lamp, reading. Names she half knew, names she had never heard. The names of beans and corn and squash, of peppers and tomatoes, of herbs and flowers. But old names, strange names, names that sang of places and people and growing seasons the girl had no map for. Names that sounded like they belonged to a world that had been quietly let go of, paved over, forgotten, while no one was watching closely enough to mind. And beside the names, on some of the jars, in fainter hand, Dates. The girl did the arithmetic as she had done at the carved name above the door, and the cold moved through her again that had nothing to do with the cave. Some of these jars had been filled long, long before Cora herself had come to the hollow. These seeds had been handed down, mother to daughter, hand to hand, carried and saved and carried again across more years than the girl could hold in her head. And Cora had gathered them, all of them, and brought them here, to the one place in the world where the cold and the dark and the dry would let them sleep without dying. The mushrooms were not the secret. The mushrooms were the harvest, the thing that fed a body day to day. This was what Cora had meant. This was what she had been keeping safe. Not a farm, an ark, a whole quiet ark of living things gathered against the day the world might finally finish letting go of them, and set adrift in the dark with no crew but a stranger the keeper would never live to meet. The girl sat down slowly on the cold, dry stone in the middle of all those sleeping jars, and she held the lamp in her lap, and she let the size of it settle over her. A woman nobody visited, a woman the world called worthless. She had spent her one quiet life building 2 cathedrals inside a mountain, one to feed the living, and one to remember everything the living had begun to forget. And she had left them both to her. It was near the door of that little room, on the lowest shelf, set a touch apart from the rest, as though it had been placed where the right hand would reach it first, that the girl found the jar with the note. It was a plain jar, beans by the look of them, dark and smooth through the old glass. The label gave a name the girl didn't know, and a date worn nearly to nothing. But tucked behind it, folded small and gone soft at the creases, was a square of paper. The girl's heart climbed into her throat. She set down the lamp. She drew the paper out with careful fingers. She unfolded it. The hand was the crooked one, the late one, the one that had shaped the words on the table. "If you have found this room," it read, "then you have found the heart of the whole thing, and you are the one I hoped for. Listen to me now. There will come a man with a kind face and a soft voice and money in his hand, perhaps more than one. They will know what is in this room before you have told a soul. They always seem to know. They will call it foolishness. They will call it sentiment. They will offer to take it off your hands, and they will smile while they say it. Do not sell it. Not for any price they name, not when you are hungry, not when you are tired, not when they have made you feel that you are nothing, and that this is nothing, and that you would be a fool to think otherwise. You are not nothing, and neither is this. Do not trust the smile, child. Plant them again." The girl read it once. Then she read it again. Slower, her lips moving over the crooked words in the lamplight. "There will come a man with a kind face." She did not know yet what that meant. She could not have pictured his face, or guessed his voice, or known the soft and reasonable shape the danger would wear when it finally came up the hollow with its hand out and its smile ready. But she folded the paper closed, and she held it against her chest, there in the cold, dry dark, among the hundreds of sleeping jars. And somewhere down in her, beneath the fear that had pricked up at the warning, something else was rising, something she had not had room for in a long, long time. Not hope, exactly. Bigger than hope. Purpose. For the first time since an iron gate had swung shut behind her, the girl knew it the way you know the ground is under your feet, that there was a thing in this world that was hers to do, a thing a stranger had trusted her with, a thing worth keeping, and if it came to it, a thing worth fighting for. She picked up the lamp. She looked once more, slowly, around that quiet room of sleeping seeds. Then she rose, and she carried the small flame back up out of the dark, past the glowing rose, up the worn passage, out through the cleared stone mouth into the soft gray light of the hollow. And the cold breath of the mountain came up behind her as she went, as if to say, "Good, now you know." The first time the girl carried a basket down to the gray little town, she nearly turned back twice. The walk was long, down out of the green hollow, along the rutted track, over the tired bridge, into the lean of those gray buildings that seemed forever on the edge of giving up. The basket was heavy on her arm. The pale things lay in it, clean and gray and freshly cut, smelling faintly of the cool dark they'd come from. She had told herself, the whole walk down, what they were worth. She had not counted on what the town would think they were. The first man she offered them to looked into the basket the way a person looks at something dead in a road. "What's wrong with them?" he said. "Nothing's wrong with them," the girl said. "They're good. Fresh this morning." "They grow in the ground?" "In the cave, up the hollow." The man stepped back as though the basket had moved toward him. "Cave mushrooms," he said, loud enough for the men by the store to hear, and a couple of them laughed. "Folks, she's selling cave mushrooms. Crawled them right up out of a hole in the hill." He shook his head. "Girl, those things'll likely poison you dead. You ought to be ashamed, trying to pass that off on honest people." The laughter spread. It was an old sound to the girl. She had heard it in a dining hall once, a long while back, when a letter had been read aloud and a room full of faces had turned to her with that same mix of pity and relief. Pity that she'd been handed nothing. Relief that they hadn't. She had not cried then. She did not cry now. She lifted the basket and she set her shoulders, and she walked on down the gray street to the next door. The next door was no kinder, nor the one after. By midday, the girl had walked the whole length of that town twice, and the basket on her arm was nearly as full as when she'd come. She had learned a thing, though, in those years she didn't speak of. She had learned that the world is slow to want what it hasn't seen, that it guards its small certainties the way a dog guards a bone, not because the bone is good, but because letting go of it feels like losing. She could not argue the town out of its certainty. Argument never moved a soul who'd already decided, but hunger could. And the town, she had begun to see as she walked it, was a hungry place. The first one to buy was a young mother. She was thin in the way that worry makes a person thin, stretched fine, the bones showing at the wrist. She had a child on her hip and another half hidden in her skirts, and she stood at the corner of the street and watched the girl with the basket for a long moment before she came over. "How much?" the woman asked, low, as if she didn't want it carried. The girl named a price so small it was almost an apology. The woman's eyes went over the pale things, over the girl, over the worn basket and the worn dress and the scabbed hands. "They safe?" the woman asked. "Yes, ma'am," the girl said. "I'd not sell you anything I'd not eat myself, I eat them every day." The woman looked at her a moment longer. Then she dug in a knotted rag for her coins. "Ada," she said by way of a name, counting them out. "And these had better be what you say. I haven't got the coin to waste, nor the children to spare." "They're what I say," the girl said. The woman took the pale things home, and the girl walked back up the hollow that evening with one coin in her pocket, and the strange, warm ache of it pressing against her leg the whole way up. The young mother came back the next week, and this time she brought her sister. The week after that, the sister brought a neighbor, and the neighbor brought a story of pale things fried up in a little fat, tender and rich and filling, that had stretched a thin table into something that felt almost like plenty. Hunger has a way of opening a mind that argument can only knock against. The town was thin those days. Work was scarce. Coin was scarcer. And here was a girl with a basket of clean, good, filling food that cost almost nothing, because the girl growing it was too proud to charge what it was worth, and too near the bone herself to charge nothing at all. By the time the cold months were closing in, the girl had something she had not had on that first humiliating walk. She had a line. Women waiting at the edge of the street on the morning she came down, baskets and rags in hand, calling her by a name some of them had learned and the rest of them had picked up. Della, the girl with the cave food. Della's come down. It was a small thing. It was the largest thing that had happened to her in years. For the first time the girl could remember, she walked into a place, and the place was glad she'd come. There was a young man in the town named Lonnie. He was a few years older than the girl, lean and easy, with a quick grin and a way of leaning against a post like he had all the time in the world. He hauled and lifted and fetched for whoever would pay him, and he had a soft spot, it seemed, for a thing nobody else would touch. He was the one who first carried her basket for her. That cold morning the line had grown too long, and her arm had gone numb with the weight. "You're working that hill alone?" he asked, walking her to the bridge. "Cutting your own wood? Hauling your own logs?" "There's no one else to do it," the girl said. "There is now," Lonnie said and grinned. "If you can pay in those mushrooms, I've grown a taste." So she paid him in mushrooms, and he came up the hollow 2 days a week, and he cut wood she could not have cut, and lifted logs she could not have lifted, and he whistled while he worked, and he made her laugh once or twice, which startled her, the laugh, because she had not known she still had it ready. He never asked to go into the cave. She noticed that later. Much later, when it mattered. At the time, she only thought, here is a person near my own age who is kind to me, and who comes when he says he'll come. And after the years she'd had, that felt like a small miracle she had no reason to question. She trusted him. She had so little practice at it that she did not even know that was what she was doing. The man came up the hollow on a soft gray afternoon, near the turn of the cold months, in a fine coat that did not belong on that muddy track. The girl saw him from the slope above the cabin, and something in her went still. She did not know him. He was a stranger entirely. He was old, too, older than she had braced for. But he wore the years lightly, the way a man wears them when he has spent every one of them getting what he wanted. There was nothing bent about him, only something patient and worn smooth and used to winning. There was a paper folded in a jar in the dark of the hill, and a warning written on it in a crooked hand. And the moment the girl saw that fine coat picking its careful way up the mud, the words of the warning rose up in her like cold water. There will come a man with a kind face and a soft voice and money in his hand. He had a kind face. That was the first thing. Open and pleasant and easy to look at. The kind of face that has spent a lifetime learning to be liked. You'd be the young lady of the hollow, he said when he reached her, and he smiled, and the smile was warm and reached his eyes, and asked nothing of her but to be trusted. I've heard a great deal about you. All of it remarkable. Who are you? The girl said. Calloway. He gave a small bow that was half a joke and half not. I represent some people with an interest in places like this one, old places, forgotten places. He looked around the hollow, at the cabin, at the cleared mouth in the hill, and his kind eyes lingered there a beat too long. Places that turn out to be worth more than anyone knew. A soft voice. I'm not selling anything, the girl said. Of course not. Of course not. Calloway raised his hands, all ease. I've not come to take a thing from you. I've come to help. A girl alone, working a hard hill, no family to lean on. His voice went gentle, sympathetic. That's a heavy load for young shoulders. My people could lift a great deal of it. We could see you well set up, comfortable, safe. Money in his hand. He let the word safe sit in the air. And the girl understood, with a cold and certain clarity, that the dead woman who had never met her had seen this man coming from beyond the edge of her own life, had known his face before the girl ever saw it, had known his voice before he spoke. I'll think on it, the girl said, because she did not yet know what else to say, and because some old, careful part of her told her not to show a stranger the size of what she felt. That's all I'd ask. Calloway smiled again. He turned to go, and then, as if it were an afterthought, as if it had only just occurred to him, he turned back. It's a wonder what's in that hill, he said lightly. The harvest, the pale things. He paused. And the rest of it. The girl's heart stopped. The rest of it, she repeated. Calloway's kind eyes held hers, and for just a flicker, something moved behind them that the kind face was not quite quick enough to hide. A collection like that, gathered over a lifetime. Why, there are people who'd give a great deal for it. To keep it safe, you understand. To see it properly looked after. It's far too important to be left to chance. To be left to the smallest pause. A child. And then the warmth came back over his face like a curtain dropping, and he tipped his hat, and he picked his careful way back down the muddy track. The girl stood on the slope a long time after he was gone. The rest of it. He knew about the seeds. He knew about the room she had cleared with her own bleeding hands. The room sealed by a dead woman behind a wall of hand-set stone. The room no living soul had been told of. He knew. And there was only one way in the world that he could know. She did not want to believe it. That was the worst of it. How hard the not wanting was. How it dug in its heels in her chest and refused to look at the plain shape of the thing. Because believing it meant losing something she had only just let herself have. She thought back. She made herself think back. the way you make yourself touch a sore tooth. Lonnie, who never asked to see the cave, but who, one rainy day, when she'd been laid up with a turned ankle, had carried logs into the mouth of the hill for her to keep them dry, just inside, just to the edge of the dark, just far enough. Lonnie, who had gone quiet the last week or two, who had stopped whistling, who had not quite met her eye when he took his mushrooms. Lonnie, who had come into a little money, somebody in the line had mentioned, bought himself a new coat. Wasn't that nice for a boy who never had 2 coins to rub? The girl sat down on the cabin step in the gray afternoon, and she put her scabbed hands over her face, and she did not cry. But it was a near thing, nearer than it had been in years, because she understood now. The one person she had let herself trust, the first one near her own age who had come when he said he'd come, and made her laugh and carried her basket. He had walked into the dark of the hill, and he had carried what he saw there back out and sold it to a man with a kind face. He came up 2 days later as if nothing had changed. She watched him climb the slope, easy and loose, the new coat too fine for the work. And she felt the thing in her chest go very cold and very still. "Brought you some good dry oak," Lonnie called, lifting a hand. "Cut it myself, down by—" "Did you tell him?" The girl's voice cut the morning clean. Lonnie stopped. The grin faltered. "Tell who what?" he said. "The man, Calloway." She stood up off the step. "Did you tell him what's down in that hill? The back room? The jars?" For a moment, just a moment, Lonnie's face tried for the old easy puzzlement, and then it gave up. Because he was not, in the end, a hard person. Only a weak one, in the way that money makes the weak weaker. "Della," he started. "Don't." Her voice did not rise. That was the worst of it, how it did not rise. "Just tell me, did you?" Lonnie looked at the ground, at his fine new coat, at anything but her. "He paid awful well," he said quietly. "And he said it weren't right anyhow. A girl your age, sitting on something worth that much. He said it'd end up doing more good in the proper hands. He made it sound—" "Get off the hill," the girl said. "Della, I never meant—" "Get off the hill, Lonnie." He stood a moment longer. Then he set down the oak he'd cut, careful, as if that small kindness might square it. It did not square it. He went down the slope, and the green took him, and the girl was alone again on the step. More alone, somehow, than she had been on the day the iron gate had swung shut. Because that day, she had lost a thing she'd never had. This day, she had lost a thing she had let herself reach for. And that is a deeper kind of cold. Calloway came back, as men like Calloway do, when they smell a thing weakening. He brought papers this time. He spread them on the cabin table in the gray light, with the careful patience of a man who has done this many times and watched it work every time. "I had hoped to do this kindly," he said, and his voice was so gentle it was almost a sorrow. "I want you to know that. I take no pleasure in it." The papers, he explained, showed a thing the girl had not known, that the hill, the hollow, the cave, and all its contents had never been so wholly the old woman's to give as the girl believed, that there was an older claim, a prior interest, a tangle of rights that a court, were it ever to come to a court, would surely settle in favor of the man with the fine coat and the deep pockets, and the papers spread on the table. You could fight it, Calloway said, and shook his kind head sadly. You could. A girl of 16, with no money, no family, no name anyone in that town would lift a finger for. He let that land, soft as snow. You could spend everything you have and a great deal you don't, and lose it all the same. And then you'd have nothing, less than nothing. He slid a single sheet toward her across the table. Or, he said, you could sign, and I could see you set up somewhere warm, somewhere kind, somewhere a girl like you might finally, and I say this with all gentleness, belong. He had found the word. The girl had not told him the word, but he had found it, dug it up the way his kind dig up everything soft in a person. Belong. The girl looked at the sheet of paper on the table, at the line where her name was meant to go, and for one long, terrible moment, she nearly reached for the pen, because he had touched the oldest wound she had. No family, no name anyone would lift a finger for, nowhere you belong. It was the song the world had been singing over her since before she could remember. The iron gate, the tired voice behind the wide desk. You're not our concern after today. The laughter in the dining hall, the cold relief on every face. Pity that she got nothing. Glad it wasn't us. She had spent a lifetime being told she was nothing. And here was a kind face, a soft voice, telling her the same old song, but dressed up now in mercy, offering to make the nothing comfortable, to tuck the nothing in somewhere warm if only she would sign her name and agree, at last, that it was true. Her hand was halfway to the pen, and then, from somewhere down in the cold and certain center of her, a crooked hand spoke. You are not nothing, and neither is this. Do not trust the smile, child. The girl pulled her hand back from the pen. No, she said. Calloway's kind face did not change, but something behind it did. I'd think hard, he said softly, before I said no to me. I have thought, the girl said. I'm saying no. She stood up from the table. Take your papers off her table. Her table? She heard herself say it. The dead woman's table. The dead woman's hollow. The dead woman's trust. Calloway gathered his papers slowly. He was not smiling now. Not truly, though the shape of it stayed pinned to his face. This isn't a thing you can win, child, he said at the door. I'll be back, with more than papers, if I have to. You'd have done better to take the kindness while it was offered. Then he was gone down the muddy track, and the girl stood alone in the cabin, her heart hammering, her hands at last betraying her, shaking, shaking. But she had said no. She went into the hill that night. She did not fully know why. She only knew that the warning had risen up in her at the table and saved her hand from the pen, and she needed, to read it again, to hold the crooked words in the lamplight and be told once more that she was not nothing. She went down the worn passage, through the great glowing chamber, through the gap she had cleared in the wall of stone, into the cool, dry dark of the seed room. She found the jar, the plain one, low on the shelf, set a touch apart, the dark beans smooth through the old glass. She drew out the soft, creased paper and read the warning again by lamplight, and it steadied her, as it had at the table. But this time, perhaps because she was looking harder, perhaps because the danger had a face now and a name, she did not stop at the paper. This time she picked up the jar itself. It was heavier than beans alone should make it. The girl frowned. She worked the old rusted ring. She tipped the dark beans out into her palm, a slow rattling stream of them. And beneath them, folded flat against the bottom of the jar, was a second paper, older than the first. The hand on it stronger, surer. The hand from the early journals before the years had bent it. The girl unfolded it with shaking fingers. And she read, "If you are reading this," it began, "then the man has come. He will be old now, older even than I am as I write this. But you will know him the moment he smiles. I knew that smile a lifetime ago, when he first climbed this hill, and I have not forgotten it since." The girl's breath stopped. "He came to me once," the crooked, no longer hand went on. "Long ago, when this hollow was younger, and so was I. A man with a kind face and a fine coat, with papers and a soft voice and a great deal of money in his hand. He told me the place was not truly mine. He showed me an older claim. He told me a woman alone could not hope to hold it, and that I would do better to take his kindness while it was offered. He lied. There was no older claim. There was no prior interest. There were only papers a clever man can have made to say anything, brought before a frightened person alone, in the hope that the fear will do the work the law cannot. I did not sign, and because I knew he, or his kind, would come again, for the harvest, or for the seeds, or for the land itself, I set things right and plain and beyond his reach. And I left the proof of it here, beneath the first seeds, where only the keeper of this room would think to look." The girl turned the page over with trembling hands. And there it was, a second sheet folded inside the first, plain and clear, and witnessed in a second hand the girl knew. The rough, square, unmistakable hand that had labeled a sack of meal and a clutch of eggs left wrapped in a rag on her step. Bertie's hand. The old woman had signed it, long ago, as the one who had seen it done, setting down, plain as plain, that the hollow and the hill and the cave and all that slept within it had passed, whole and free, and beyond any clever man's reach, to the blood of the woman who kept it, to the girl who would one day clear the vines, to her. Cora had not only built her 2 cathedrals in the dark, she had built a wall around them too, a wall the girl could not see, just as she had not, at first, been able to see the cave behind the green, and she had handed the girl the key to it, buried beneath the first seeds, where only the right one would look. The girl sat down on the cold, dry stone, the 2 papers in her lap, the dark beans scattered around her in the lamplight. And this time, she let herself cry. Not the broken crying of the lost, the other kind, the kind that comes when a person who has been alone a long, long time discovers, late and almost too late, that someone had been holding them up the whole while, from beyond the reach of seeing. She was not nothing. She had never been nothing. A woman she had never met had known it, and written it down, and hidden it under the seeds, and trusted her to come looking. Calloway came back, as he had promised. He came on a clear, cold morning, and he did not come alone. He brought 2 men in coats nearly as fine as his, and he brought more papers, and he brought, riding low under the kind old face, the hard certainty of a man who has never once been told no by someone who could make it stick. But the girl had sent word down the hollow the night before, and when Calloway and his fine-coated men came up the muddy track, They found they were not the only ones who had climbed it. The young mother was there, Ada, thin and fierce, her children left below, her sister, the neighbor, a dozen women from the line, and then a dozen more, and men too. Some of the same men who had laughed in the gray street at a girl selling cave food, standing now, quiet and watchful, along the slope of the hollow. And at the front of them, square and small and immovable as a stone in a creek, stood Bertie. Calloway's kind face took them all in. The smile flickered. "This is a private matter," he said, "between myself and the young lady. It would be best." "It was a private matter the last time, too," the girl said. She came down the slope toward him, the two papers in her hand, and her voice carried clear across the cold morning, and it did not shake. "You came to her grandmother once," the girl said, "long ago, with that same kind face and a fine coat and papers that said the place wasn't hers. You told her a woman alone couldn't hope to hold it. You told her to take your kindness while it was offered." Calloway went very still. "She didn't sign," the girl said, "and she wrote it all down. Your face, your soft voice, your papers that say whatever a clever man pays to have them say." She lifted the older sheet. "There's no prior claim. There never was. There's only this, set down plain and witnessed, and put beyond your reach a lifetime before you came crawling back to try the same trick on her granddaughter." She turned to the watching crowd. "He counted on me being alone," she said more quietly, but every soul on that slope heard it. "He counted on me having no one, no family, no name any of you would lift a finger for." Her eyes moved over the thin faces, the worn faces, the faces she had fed through a hard, cold season. "He counted on me believing I didn't belong anywhere." A silence held over the hollow, and then Bertie stepped forward and planted her feet, and looked the man with the kind face dead in the eye. "I signed that paper," the old woman said, "with these two hands. I saw it done, and I'll say so to anyone, anywhere, any day you'd care to name." She spat deliberately into the mud at the edge of his fine shoe. "Now you've been told to twice by 2 generations of better women than you'll ever deserve to stand near. Take your papers and your hired faces and get off this hill." For a long moment, Calloway did not move. The kind face worked. The smile tried and failed and tried again. He looked at the papers in the girl's steady hand. He looked at the old woman's planted feet. He looked at the slope full of quiet, watching people who had decided somewhere in the last hard season that the girl with the cave food was theirs. And he's understood, the way his kind understands everything a beat too late, that there was nothing here for him to take. A girl alone he could break. A girl with a hollow full of people at her back. He could not. He turned without another word. He and his fine-coated men picked their careful way back down the muddy track, and this time no one laughed and no one spoke, and the only sound was the creek going on about its endless business over the stones. And the green took them, and they did not come. Again. The girl stood on the slope in the cold, clear morning, with the 2 papers in her hand, and the whole hollow gathered quiet around her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ada, thin, fierce Ada, with her knotted rag of coins and her 2 hungry children waiting below, came up the slope, and she did not say anything clever, and she did not make a speech. She just reached out and she took the girl's scabbed hand in both of hers, and she held it. And one by one, the others came up too. An old man who'd called the mushrooms poison and bought them anyway, ashamed all season. A woman who'd brought her sister, who'd brought her neighbor. The whole long line of them who had walked up out of a hard cold season to stand on a slope for a girl most of them had laughed at once. Nobody made a speech. They just stood with her on the hill in the cold, bright morning. And the girl, who had been handed a bag a child could lift and told she was no one's concern, and left to walk out an iron gate with no one to follow, stood in the middle of all those people and understood at last what the warning under the seeds had really been protecting. Not the harvest, not even the seeds, her. A place where she belonged, and she had not been given it. She had cleared the way to it herself, with her own 2 bleeding hands. The hollow was quiet for a long while after the man with the kind face went down the track and did not come back up. It was the good kind of quiet, the kind that settles over a place once a thing that was holding its breath has finally let it out. The girl noticed it first in the mornings. She would step out onto the worn stone of the doorstep with the cold air sharp in her chest, and the creek would be talking to its stones as it had on the very first day. But something underneath had changed. She was not bracing anymore. For a long time, longer than she had understood, even while she lived it, some part of her had been standing braced against the next voice that would tell her to go, against the next door that would close, against the iron sound a gate makes when the world has decided it is finished with you. That part of her, slowly, had begun to set down its weight. And in its place, something else was rising. She began with the slope above the cabin. It faced the soft side of the sky, where the light came longest, and the dead woman's journals had marked it for exactly that. Good ground here, if a body has the back for the building of it. The girl had the back for it. She had bled 3 days clearing vines. She could move a little stone, so she moved a great deal of it. She gathered the loose gray rock from the hillside, and she stacked it into low walls along the slope, the way one of Cora's books had shown. Walls to hold the soil, to keep the steep ground from sliding away in the wet, to make of a tilted hillside a set of level shelves a thing could grow on. It was slow work, honest work, the kind that gives nothing back the first day, or the 10th, and then one morning gives back everything at once. She hauled spent material up out of the cave, the old logs that had finished their giving, the dark crumbled stuff from the bottom of the beds, and she worked it into the thin mountain soil until the soil went dark and rich and smelled the way the floor of the great chamber smelled. And then, on a soft morning, when the cold had begun to loosen its hold, she went down into the dark, and she carried up the jars. She opened them one at a time. That felt right to her, to open them slowly, to not pour out a lifetime of gathering all in a rush. She would lift a jar from the shelf and read the name on it in Cora's careful hand and carry it up out of the hill into the daylight and kneel at the dark new ground. And she would tip a few of those old seeds into her palm, small, hard, dry, asleep. Seeds that had been handed down hand to hand across more years than she could hold in her head. Seeds the world had begun to let go of, quietly, while no one was watching closely enough to mind. Seeds a strange, solitary woman had gathered out of the corners of a forgetting world and carried into a mountain and kept cold and dark and dry against this very morning. The girl pressed them into the ground. She covered them over. And she waited. They grew. There is no plain way to say how they grew. The girl had read of growing things her whole life. Stolen pages by candlestub, Cora's books by lamplight. But reading of a thing and kneeling in the dirt while it happens are two different countries. The old seeds came up out of that dark, rich ground as if they had been waiting their whole long sleep for someone to give them the chance. Beans climbed. They climbed past her knee, past her waist, past her head, winding up the poles she set for them and reaching for more, heavy with pods. Squash sprawled across the terraces in great rough leaves and swelled into fruits so large she had to carry them in both arms. There were tomatoes, the deep bruised color of a stormy dusk, so sweet they made a person close their eyes. There were herbs whose names Cora had set down in a hand the girl could only half make out. Old plants, healing plants, the journal said, grown and tended and passed along by people across more seasons than there were words to count. And there were flowers. The girl had not expected to care about the flowers. A flower does not fill a thin table the way a bean does. But she planted them because Cora had saved them. And a thing worth saving is worth growing. And when they came up, in colors she had no names for, nodding along the gray stone walls in the soft morning wind. The girl stood among them with dirt on her hands and tears she did not bother to hide, and she understood that the dead woman had saved the flowers for exactly this. For the moment, a tired heart, kneeling in hard ground, would look up and find that the world had decided to be beautiful after all. It was the things growing that brought him up the hollow. His name was Eli. He came one morning as the man with the kind face had come, a stranger picking his way up the muddy track, and the girl, who had learned what strangers could cost, watched him climb with her heart gone wary and her hand near the hoe. But this one climbed differently. He stopped to look at things. He crouched by the lower terrace and turned a leaf over with one careful finger, like a person handling a thing they have respect for. And when he straightened and saw her watching, he did not smile the easy, practiced smile of a man who has learned to be liked. He just nodded, slow, and said, "Heard there was someone up here growing things nobody else could grow." "Who told you that?" the girl said. "Half the valley." A corner of his mouth moved. "The other half says you grow food out of a haunted cave, and a body'd be a fool to eat it." He looked back down at the terraces, at the climbing beans, at the impossible squash. "I came to see which half was lying." And Eli was quiet a moment, looking at all of it. At the dark, rich ground that had been thin gray dirt. At the old seeds come roaring up into the light. "Neither one knows the half of it," he said. He was a quiet man, quiet the way deep water is quiet. He had hands that were gentle with a seedling and rough with a stone, and he knew the work without being told it. And when he did not know a thing, he asked plainly and listened to the answer. He came back. He did not make a fuss of coming back. He simply turned up the next week with a sack of good seed potatoes he thought might do well on the upper terrace. And he set to digging without being asked, and he ate what she fed him and grumbled like Bertie that she still overcooked the pale things. The girl let him come. She did not decide to, exactly. She had not the practice for deciding such things. It was more that one season he was a stranger picking up the hollow, and somewhere across the turning of it, he became a thing she expected. A shape on the track in the morning, a steady back bent over the rows, a low voice naming the weather. He did not crowd her. That was the thing about Eli. He had a stillness that asked for nothing. And slowly, across a span of seasons, the slow, patient way the best things grow, the girl who had braced her whole life against the next person leaving stopped bracing against this one. There was no grand moment. The girl would not have known what to do with a grand moment. There was only an evening, late in a good season, the terraces heavy with the harvest, the light gone long and golden over the gray walls, and the climbing green. They were sitting on the doorstep, the two of them, tired in the good way, watching the hollow go blue with dusk. And Eli said, not looking at her, in the same plain voice he used for the weather, "A body could make a life here. A whole one." The girl looked out at the terraces, at the dark mouth in the hill, at the slope where she had bled, and the ground she had built, and the seeds she had woken out of their long sleep. "A body could," she said, and that was all. It was enough. It was, in fact, the most that either of them needed to say. Two people who had learned, by different hard roads, that the realest things do not announce themselves. They just take root, quietly, in good ground, and then one day you look up, and they have grown past your head, and you cannot rightly remember the time before them. The work outgrew the two of them, in time. In the best way, a thing can outgrow you. It started with the seeds. Word had gone round the valley, first as a joke, then as a wonder, that the girl in the hollow had old varieties no one had seen in years. Beans somebody's grandmother used to grow. A squash a body remembered from childhood and had given up for lost. Tomatoes with names like songs. And people began to come, not to laugh now, not to gawk, to trade. They came up the muddy track with little twists of paper and old jars of their own, carrying seeds they had been keeping, a handful here, a pinch there, the last of some line their own people had grown and saved and grown again. And the girl did the thing the crooked hand had asked of her. She did not sell them, not for any price, not when she was tired, not when the cold months were lean, not when a clever face came round, and one or two still did, with money in the hand and reason on the tongue. She gave them. She gave seed to anyone who would promise to grow it and save it and pass it on. She kept careful count, as Cora had, of what came in and what went out, and what thrived in the mountain ground, and what wanted gentler care. She filled new jars and carried them down into the cool, dry dark of the back room, and the room that had held one dead woman's lifetime of saving began, slowly, to hold a whole valley's. The hollow that had been a place of one woman's solitude became a place people came to. There was a gathering, after a few good seasons, on the terraces above the cabin. It was not planned, the first one. It only happened. The folks who had come to trade lingered, and more came than expected, and somebody brought food, and somebody brought a fiddle. And before the day was out, the slope where the girl had once knelt alone in the dirt was full of people swapping seeds and swapping stories and tasting the impossible squash and arguing happily over whose grandmother's beans were finest. The thin young mother was there. Ada, less thin now, her children grown taller, her laugh come easier. The old man who had once called the mushrooms poison was there, and he ate 3 platefuls, and said nothing about poison, and the girl had the grace not to remind him. And Bertie was there. Bertie sat in a good chair somebody had hauled up the slope for her, with a quilt over her knees against the chill she felt now even in the warm light, and she watched the whole of it. The people, the food, the seeds going hand to hand, the music, the girl moving through the middle of it all like she had grown up to fit the place. And the old woman's weathered face did a thing the girl had near to never seen it do. It went soft. All the way soft. She'd have hated this, Bertie said, when the girl came and sat by her chair. All these people, all this noise, your grandmother. The old woman's eyes were wet, and she did not trouble to hide it. She'd have hated every blessed minute of it. The girl waited. And she'd have been prouder than she had any words for, Bertie said. Both at once. That was her, all over, both at once. She reached over and she put her old root of a hand on the girl's hand, and she pressed it once. It was the first time the girl realized that Bertie had ever touched her on purpose. It would not be the last, but it was the first. Bertie went the way good people go when they have lived an honest life all the way to the end of it, gently, in the fullness of her years. On a soft, bright morning, in her own cabin down the creek, with the window open to the sound of the water she had listened to her whole life. The girl was with her. There was no fear in it at the end. Bertie had no patience for fear, and less for fuss. You did it right, the old woman said, near the last, her voice gone to a thread. The cave, the seeds, the people, all of it. You did it right, girl. A pause while she gathered the breath for the rest. She picked the right one. Cora did. I told her she was a fool, waiting on a child she'd never see. I was the fool. The girl held the old root of a hand and did not trust herself to speak. Don't you let it go quiet again, Bertie said. That hollow. Don't you let it go back to one lonely soul in the dark. You hear me? Keep it full. I hear you, the girl managed, and Bertie nodded, satisfied, the way she nodded over a thing well done. And a little while after that, with the window open and the creek talking, and the morning coming gold across the floor, the old woman let go of the breath she'd been carrying 80-some years, and did not take another. The girl buried her on the hill, high up above the terraces, in a place where the morning light came first and a body could look down over the whole of the hollow, the cabin, the dark mouth in the stone, the gray walls, and the climbing green, and all the rows of growing things. Where Bertie could keep an eye on it, the girl thought, as she always had. And at the head of the grave, the girl planted the flowers. The deep ones, the bruised dusk ones, the kind Bertie had said once, gruff, embarrassed at being caught saying a soft thing, were the finest she had laid eyes on in all her long years. The girl had saved their seed for exactly this. She knelt in the good ground she had built, and she pressed them in, and she covered them over as she had covered the very first seeds. And this time the crying came easy, and it was not the crying of the lost. It was the other kind, the kind that comes when you have loved a person and lost them, and known, in the losing, that the loving was real and was returned, and was worth every ache of the going. The girl had not had much practice at that kind of grief. It is a strange thing to say of grief, that a person can be grateful for the chance to feel it, but she was, because to grieve like that, you have first to have belonged to someone, and she had. At last, she had. The flowers came up the next season, deep and nodding, along the high grave where the morning light came first. And every season after, they came again. The years went on, as years do. The girl was not a girl anymore. The hands that had bled clearing vines grew strong, and then grew lined, and then grew old. The dark hair went gray, and then white. Eli's quiet stillness gentled into the deep settled quiet of a man who has spent a whole life in good work beside a person he loved, and who would not, given every chance in the world, have spent it any other way. They raised the work, the two of them. They raised more than the work. But every morning of every season, soft weather or hard, young or old, full house or empty, the woman who had once been a girl with nowhere to go did the same first thing. She lit the lamp. She walked up the slope to the cleared mouth in the hill, and she went down into the cool dark, alone, into the great glowing chamber where the pale things grew. And she walked the rows as Cora must have walked them, and she checked the cool and the damp and the steady breath of the place. And she talked to it, not out loud most mornings, just a kind of attending, a listening, a keeping of faith with the living thing in the dark that gave back more than it was given, season on season, as long as someone came down to tend it. She was the keeper now. She had not been born to it. She had been handed a bag a child could lift, and told she was no one's concern, and walked out an iron gate with no one to follow. And she had cleared the way to this with her own two hands. She thought about that some mornings, standing in the cool breath of the hill among the pale, glowing rows. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had built 2 cathedrals in the dark, and a wall around them no clever man could climb, and then had let the green grow up over the door, and trusted that the right one would come. She had been right. Not because the girl was special. The keeper still did not think she had been special, but because she had been desperate enough to try, and patient enough to keep on after the trying turned to bleeding, and brave enough when a kind face offered to make her comfortable in her nothing, to say no. The vines, she had come to understand across all those seasons, had never been the obstacle. The vines were the test, and what waits behind them is worth the work. It is, in the end, the only thing that ever truly is. There came a day, late in the long good life of the Hollow, that the keeper had been quietly waiting for without quite knowing it. A child came up the track, a girl, thin in the way that worry makes a body thin, with the bones showing at the wrist, and a cloth bag held in one hand, a bag a child could lift, and eyes gone wary and watchful in the way of someone who has learned, too early, that the world is slow to want them. The keeper knew that look. She had worn it once, climbing this very track, with everything she owned in one small bag and nowhere else in the world to go. The girl stopped at the edge of the terraces. She did not come closer. She stood there, braced, the way you stand when you are sure that any moment now a voice will tell you to go. They said, the girl started. Her voice was rough with disuse. They said There was a woman up here. They said she takes in. She stopped. She could not seem to find the word. The keeper knew that word too. The word that sticks in the throat of a child who has been told too many times that they are a problem, a burden, a thing to be passed along. Come up, the keeper said gently. You've come a long way, and you'll be hungry. The girl did not move. There's a place for you here, the keeper said. Whether you stay a night or stay a lifetime, there's a place. She let that settle, soft as snow. Nobody's going to send you on, not from this hill. And something in the wary face cracked, just at the edges, just for a breath, the way the keeper's own face had cracked long ago. Kneeling among the flowers, a dead woman had saved for exactly that moment. The girl came up the slope. She fed her first. That came before all else. She sat the child at the worn table, the dead woman's table, scrubbed soft now by more years of hands than Cora's alone. And she set food before her, and she watched the girl eat as she herself had once eaten, fast and hunched and disbelieving, glancing up between bites as if the plate might be taken back. It was not taken back. It would not be. And when the girl had eaten her fill, when she had pressed her hands to her middle in the old astonished way, the way of a body that had near forgotten the meaning of full, the keeper rose and took down the lamp and said, "Come, there's something you ought to see." She led the girl up the slope in the soft falling light to the mouth of the cave. It was clear, mostly. The keeper tended it, but here and there along the edges of the stone she had let a little of the green grow back. A few ropes of vine curling across the rock, half veiling the dark. She had let them grow on purpose. She could not have said exactly why. All those seasons she had let them. She understood it now. The keeper stopped at the cleared mouth, and she put the lamp into the girl's thin hands, and the small flame lit the wary young face from below. Then she reached into the deep pocket of her apron, and she drew out a thing she had been carrying, it seemed, toward this very evening. A journal, bound in plain new leather, its pages soft and empty, waiting. She put it into the girl's hands beside the lamp. The girl looked down at the lamp and the blank book, and then up at the dark mouth in the hill, half curtained in green, breathing its cool, steady breath out into the dusk. "What's in there?" the girl whispered. The keeper looked at the dark she had tended her whole long life, at the green she had let grow back across its edges, at the child standing at the threshold with a lamp in her hands, and the whole unwritten thing ahead of her. "That," the keeper said softly, "is for you to find out." She stepped back. "The door is behind the vines," she said. "It has been all along, for everyone who ever came up this hill. The clearing of it is the hardest, dirtiest, most thankless work there is, and no one will clap for you while you do it." A small, worn smile. "And what waits on the other side is worth every cut and every bleeding hand. Worth more than they will ever tell you. Down in the gray places that called you a problem." The cool breath rose from the hill and stirred the green and touched both their faces in the falling light. "Go on," the keeper said. "Clear the way. The rest is yours." And the girl, thin, wary, holding a lamp and an empty book at the mouth of a mountain, took one breath and lifted the small, steady flame and stepped through the vines into the breathing dark. just as a girl had done long ago, with nowhere else in all the world to go. So, here is the thing worth carrying away from a story like this one. Somewhere in your own life, there is a hillside grown over with green, a door you walk past, a thing handed to you and called worthless. Not money, perhaps, not land, but something quieter, a knowledge, a gift, a trust, something somebody who came before you tried to keep safe and could only keep safe by hiding it, and could only hide by trusting that one day the right person would come along and care enough to clear the way. Most people walk past. The clearing is hard. The vines fight back. The hands bleed, and no one applauds. And the tired voices all around are so very sure there's nothing behind the green worth the trouble of finding. But the most valuable things are almost always the hidden ones. Not because they are small, because the world grows over them. Neglect covers them. Time buries them. And it takes a particular kind of soul, desperate enough to try, and patient enough to keep on, and brave enough to say no to the kind face that offers comfort in exchange for giving up, to pull back the green, and step into the breathing dark, and find what has been waiting there, in the cool and the quiet, all along. Your hillside is overgrown. Something is waiting behind the vines. Go on. Clear the way.